Hello and welcome. My name's George, and my channel is all about helping you get the most out of Logic Pro so that you can record and produce your best music in your home studio. Today, I'm going to show you everything you need to know about getting started with software instruments in Logic Pro. We're going to talk about what software instruments are and how to use them. We'll go through the different software instruments that are included and bundled in Logic Pro, and then we'll get into actually recording and editing these software instruments. So let's dive in. So when you first start up Logic Pro, this is likely what you're going to see. So these are the different kind of tracks that we have available to us to first create. We have MIDI software instrument track, a pattern software instrument track, a drummer track, and an audio track. Now, in short, an audio track, this is going to be if you're recording something using a microphone or if you're using audio samples. And all of these three tracks can be considered software instrument tracks. To start, I'm just going to start with the MIDI software instrument track. The pattern track is just a different way of inputting the MIDI information, which we'll look at a little bit later. And the drummer is a way of creating drum parts for you automatically. So we'll dive into that a little bit later as well. Now, external MIDI, this would be if you had a separate keyboard, let's say, and you wanted to trigger some of the sounds from that, then you would look at using external MIDI. But for any instruments that reside within Logic, you're going to want to use the software instrument. So now that I've selected the software instruments, down here you have a few options. We can either choose the instrument right away by clicking on this menu, and you'll see all the different instruments available to us. Or we can just start with an empty channel strip. I'm going to start with an empty channel strip, and that way I can show you the different ways that you can load in a software instrument. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create. And that creates my instrument track up here. And now on the left, I have my channel strip. And whatever track you have selected here, that's going to get mirrored right here. So you see here it says instrument 1, and it says instrument 1 as well. And if I rename this just by double clicking, call this, let's say, software instrument. Now you'll see that says software instrument down here too. So if you're wondering what a software instrument actually is, well, it's a plugin that allows us to perform different sounds depending on what our different instrument is. So for example, we could perform using a piano sound, maybe a violin sound, a horn, a synthesizer. We have a wide range of instruments that we can use. And we can perform these using either a MIDI keyboard, or we can input MIDI simply by drawing it in, using the pencil tool, or using notation. And we'll get into all of that as well. So to start, we have our empty channel strip here. And you'll notice here it says instrument. Now, if I click right here, this will bring up our menu. And here you can see all the different software instruments that are available to us in Logic. So at the very top here, we have Alchemy. And this is Logic's main synthesizer. And before I load this in, you'll see that this says stereo. But if I hover over some of them, they'll either say multi-output, mono, and or stereo. Now, generally speaking, I would suggest that you choose stereo. I'll try to explain the difference between stereo and mono. So if we're dealing with a mono signal, such as, let's say, this monophonic synth. So what this means is the signal coming out of both your left and right speakers or your headphones are going to sound the same. So you won't get any kind of effects, let's say a delay or something like that, that pans from the left side to the right. Now in a stereo signal that you might find in Alchemy, that's where you're going to get some of those effects. So as I said, sometimes you have effects like delay or reverb, and there'll be some panning that happens where the sound changes from the left to right channel, and that makes it sound really wide and big. So in order to take advantage of those effects, you want to have it set to stereo. Now, some instruments like bass, where you generally want that in the middle of your mix, then you would select mono. So I'll go ahead and open up Alchemy so you can see what that looks like. And now we have our synthesizer software instrument. And if I play my MIDI keyboard, it'll sound like this. And with most software instruments in Logic, you have all your presets up here. So where it says default preset, if I click on that, here you'll see all these different presets available to me. Now, the cool thing about Alchemy is you also have all these categories here in this kind of browser where you can find sounds even quicker than just using the presets here. So for example, if I want a pad, I can just click pad. If I want an evolving pad, if I want something that's going to be kind of funky, then that narrowed down the preset just to this one preset here. And that'll sound like this. And maybe you heard there the difference between the left and the right speakers with kind of those effects bouncing back and forth. So that's an example of a stereo sound source. So I'll quickly go through all the different software instruments that are included free in Logic Pro. So that was Alchemy. And if you want to change to another software instrument on the same track that you're already on, you just go over here and you see these little arrows here. We'll click on that, and that'll bring up our menu again. So now we have the drum kit designer, and this is different acoustic sounding drums. And again, we have our presets up here that we can change the kits. And within the kits themselves too, you can change the different snares and change some of the other parameters as well. Next, there's also the drum synth. So this might be an instance where you want to select mono depending on the effect you're going for. So we have kicks, snares and claps, percussion, and hats and crash. So this is your more electronic type drum sounds. Then we have a number of different synths here. So we have our FM synth, our ensemble synth, our monophonic synth, polyphonic synth, and again, with all our different presets happening here. And then the ES1 synth and ES2 synth. So all these synths I just showed, these are ones that have been included in Logic for a long, long time. And they've kind of been replaced by Alchemy, which is the newest one, but there's some cool sounds to be found in here as well. So don't count them out. Next, we have the vocoder synth, which sounds like that on its own. But the cool thing about the vocoder synth is you can actually root in your own voice into it as well and get that vocoder Daft Punk type of sound if that's what you're after. Next, we have the quick sampler. So once again, up in the presets, you can find a bunch of different instruments. Or you can actually load in your own sounds by dropping in audio files right here. Or you can record in your own sounds too if we go to the recorder. So I'll demonstrate that quickly. So I'm just going to go to input here, select input 1, which is my microphone. And let's go ahead and record that. Ooh. So now I've recorded my voice in there. I'm just going to trim this Maybe fade it a little bit. And now if I hold down a note on my MIDI keyboard, now I can play in notes using the audio that I just recorded. Next, we have the retro synth. This is kind of modeled off a Moog synthesizer. And again, we have all our presets up here, but we also have kind of 4 synths built in here. So we have the analog synth, the sync synth, table synth, and the FM synth. Next, we have Sample Alchemy. Now, this is another sampler, but it gives us a whole bunch more different ways to manipulate the sound. I've got a whole video tutorial on the Sample Alchemy that you can go check out as well. But again, if you want to just use some of the presets, those are all found right here. And you can see the recorded WAV file that's used right here. But as I mentioned, you can load in your own as well. Now we also have the sampler, which is kind of a more souped up version of the quick sampler. And this is where you'll find some of your more acoustic type instruments. So your pianos, your strings, your horns, and orchestral type instruments. So there's your strings, for example. Next, we have Sculpture, which is a modeling synth. We have Studio Horns. You can load in sections as well as individual instruments. And similarly, we have Studio Strings. And again, you can load in a whole string ensemble. Now, Ultrabeat. This is another more kind of electronic type drum sounds. And again, we have all our presets here. We have a B3 organ too. And you can change the drawbars here to change the sound. Or you have all your presets here. The clav, another keyboard instrument. The electric piano, so this will be your Rhodes and Worley type sounds. And the mellotron. And this was popularized in the Beatles song Strawberry Fields in that intro. Now, utility, you don't have to concern yourself too much with these. This is just the metronome instrument, for example. And the very last one is the drum machine designer. And I've got another entire video on the drum machine designer as well, if you want to check that out too. But in order to load in different kits, just go up here where it says software instruments, and now you can select your electronic drum kit. Now, when we loaded in the drum machine designer, you might have noticed that it opened up this menu here. And this is our library, which we can open and close with this icon up here, or hit the letter Y on your typing keyboard. So far, every time I loaded in a new instrument, I did so using the channel strip here. But there is another method to load in software instruments, and that is using this library. And if you look over here, you'll see all the different instruments available to us. So let's say we wanted a bass instrument instead. Then we can click on bass here, and here's all these different bass instruments available to us. So let's say I select muted bass. Now you'll see it loaded in the sampler instrument. And then you'll also notice that it loaded in a bunch of different audio effects below it. So that's kind of the difference between loading in instruments using the channel strip and loading in instruments from the library. When you load in instruments using the library, it's basically acting as different channel strip presets. So it's going to add all of these effects to your tracks as well, not only the instrument itself, so the sampler in this case. And if you want to open up the sampler and change anything, you just go in the middle here where these two little lines are, and that'll open that up. And then on the right, this will turn on and off the plugin itself. So for example, if I change this to a keyboard instrument, you'll notice the instrument itself is going to change, but also all the plugins below. So now we have the retro synth and a compressor, chorus, and EQ plugin. So generally for me, I prefer to load in instruments just by using the channel strip. And that way I'm not adding any plugins that I don't want, and I can add those in myself later. But the library is also a quick and easy way to find sounds without having to go through all the different instruments. You just narrow it down based on the sound you're looking for, and it'll load in the appropriate instrument already for you. So now that we've explored all of the different software instruments available to us, let's look at how you'd actually record and get something down in Logic Pro. So to start, I'm just going to hide my library here, and I'm going to go up here where it says Mini Marimba, and I'm just going to reset the channel strip and kind of start from scratch here. And why don't I just start with the electric piano? So there's a few different ways that we can go about recording the electric piano into Logic. The first one is using a MIDI keyboard. So I have my MIDI keyboard in front of me, and I'm just going to go ahead and hit record, and then I'm going to play some notes in. So we can either hit the record button up here or simply press the letter R, and then we're going to get a count in based on what we have set here. So 1 bar, so I'm going to hit here 4 beats. So let's run 4/4 time. Then I'll hit spacebar to stop. And if I double click, now we can see these notes that I recorded in. And if I hit return, that's going to go to the beginning. And spacebar to stop and hear that again. So that's one way of putting in MIDI. Now, if you don't have a MIDI keyboard, there's a few different options for us. So I'm just going to delete this by selecting it and hitting delete. And I'm going to go up here where it says window and go to show musical typing. And here, there's basically, you can see this kind of piano, which we can hit with the mouse, or on my typing keyboard, if I hit the letter A, for example, A, E, F, then I get that chord. A, E, G, I get this chord. So I can input MIDI using this typing keyboard as well. Now, another way is to actually draw in the MIDI with your mouse. So if I go up here, I can right click and I can go create MIDI region. And that's a blank MIDI region here. And I can drag this to extend it if I want. And now if I go down here, which is our piano roll, and I select my pencil tool as my secondary command click tool. So now if I hold down command, you'll see my pencil. And if I click, that inputs my note, and I can drag that wherever I want, and I can resize it. And I can draw in notes wherever I want, like that. And I can, of course, resize them. And if I want to make a copy, I can simply hold down Option can click and drag, and I can move these wherever I want as well. If I want to delete them, then I just select and hit delete. Now you can do a similar thing using the score. So if you're more used to working on score, you can switch over to the score mode, and then you can simply drag in notes to where you want them. And then again, if I hit enter or return to go to the beginning and spacebar, then that plays those notes. Now, another way we can do this, I'm going to go back to the piano roll and delete this, is what's called using a pattern region. So I simply right click here on the track and go create pattern region. And that creates these, as the name suggests, pattern regions. And this is the same thing as if we were to create a new track with the plus button that we saw at the beginning, this pattern. So you can still create a pattern just on a regular software instruments track, which is why that's why I started with it. And now, if you simply click on these different regions based on the notes you want, if I hit spacebar, you'll hear what that sounds like. And now it's just repeating that cycle based on a number of steps I have, which you can increase if you'd like. Now, this pattern region is usually most often used when you're creating drum patterns, because it makes it quite easy for that. And I've got a whole video on that as well that you can check out. And the last thing I'll touch on is the drummer, since I mentioned that briefly earlier. So again, when you hit this little add tracks, you get this drummer option, but you can also add a drummer to any track you have. So if I, once again, right click here, you'll see populate with drummer regions. Now, this isn't going to be particularly useful for us right now since we're using this electric piano. But if I change this to, let's say, the drum kit designer, I'll close that. And let's just delete this that we had previously. I'll right click and go populate with drummer regions. Now we have these kind of drum loops that sound like this. And we can either edit the MIDI right in the piano roll, or if we go over here to drummer, this is where we can kind of tweak our drum sequence even more. And once again, I've got a full tutorial on using the drummer too that you can check out. Now, the last thing I'll show you is just diving into the piano roll a little bit, because this is where you're going to spend most of your time when you're editing MIDI. So I'm going to get rid of my drummer tracks and let's go back to our electric piano, for example. And I'll just hit enter to get back to the beginning, and I'll just record something in once again. So I'll hit the letter R and record a piano part. Okay, so first off, this is all our MIDI notes in here. And when you've recorded something in, you can edit and move anything around. The first thing I'm going to do is zoom in a little bit, which to do that, I'm just going to hold down Option on my keyboard, and you see this magnifying glass that shows up, and I can click and drag and zoom into that. Now, you'll notice this note, for example, that's not supposed to be there. That was a mistake. So I can simply select that, hit delete, and that gets rid of that. Now, the other thing you'll notice is these notes aren't all lined up together. right? If I put my cursor here, you'll see these two notes are pretty good. This one's a little bit late. This one's a little bit early. Those ones are pretty close. That's pretty close, but that one's a little bit early. So there's those little discrepancies like that. So if you're not the greatest keyboard player and you want to kind of improve some of the timing, what we can do is called quantizing. So if I select all these notes, here where you see this little Q, this is the quantizing. And when I hit the Q, it's going to quantize to the closest 16th note. That means it's going to push all these notes to the closest 16th note. So if I hit that, you'll see how that snaps everything into place. So that's called quantizing. And now we can adjust the strength of the quantizing. So if you still want to keep some of that natural playing, you can drag this back and then you'll see how those notes shift a little bit. So quantizing is one important thing that you'll want to get to know. And then, as I mentioned before, we can resize any of these notes. If you played a note in the wrong pitch, we can click and drag and place that wherever we want. And as well, we can simply select and delete. Or if you want to undo, you can go Command Z and that'll undo that. And of course, we can still add notes in here using the pencil tool. So if you missed a note, you want to add that back in, just do that. And the other thing I'll mention is velocity. So that has to do with how hard we hit the note. So you notice most of these are green, but this one's a little on the kind of brown yellow side. So that's because I actually hit this note a little bit harder. And that's going to change the sound of most software instruments. So for example, right now, if I hit my key softly, the note's quiet. But as I start hitting it harder, it's going to get louder. So that's changing the velocity. And you can change the velocity after the fact too. So if I select this note and here you'll see if it's red, that means it's going to be the loudest. And if I bring this down all the way to purple, it's going to be a lot quieter, to the point where we can barely hear it. So sometimes you'll accidentally play a note quieter or louder than some of the others. And if you want to kind of blend those, then the velocity is the way to do that. So I hope that's been helpful to get you started using software instruments in Logic Pro. There's a lot of different sounds and instruments to explore. So take your time going through most of those and have some fun with that. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave those in the comments below. And if you want to improve your workflow in Logic Pro, don't forget to download my free Ultimate Logic Pro Starter Pack. This includes my Logic Pro hotkey cheat sheet, my audio recording checklist, my mixing guide, and my Logic Pro session templates. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you in the next one.